Imagine waking up on the morning of August 2nd, 1838, right? You're in Jamaica,
Hmm.
and the law says you are finally legally free. The chains of slavery are officially gone.
Right. The ultimate milestone.
Exactly. So you step out the door of the small hut your family has lived in for generations. The sun is shining. The air feels completely different.
Yeah.
But by noon, the terrifying reality of this new world just sort of sets in because you realize your former enslaver still owns the ground beneath your feet.
They own the fields. They own the roof over your head.
Right. You've basically won the ultimate game of liberation, only to realize your opponent owns the board, they hold all the pieces, and they are actively rewriting the rules of survival.
It is a profound shock to the system. I mean, history books, they love to focus on the stroke of the pen, right? The Emancipation Act.
Oh, for sure. The big celebratory moment.
Exactly. But the actual lived experience of that freedom was far more complicated. And frankly, it was far more treacherous for the people on the ground.
Because you have the legal title of free citizen, but absolutely zero economic infrastructure to actually support that freedom.
None. Zero.
And that is exactly where we are going today. Welcome into this custom deep dive, crafted specifically for you. We know you are the learner.
You're the kind of person who doesn't just want the standard Wikipedia summary of a historical event.
Yeah, you want the mechanics, the hidden stories, the actual math of how things worked. You want those real aha moments without being talked down to or buried in impossible jargon.
And today, we have a fascinating stack of source material centered around a document called The First Frontier, Emancipation, and the Jamaican Matriarchal Backbone.
It's such a great source.
It really is. Our mission today is to look directly at what happened the morning after the celebration ended. We are zooming in on the immediate post-emancipation era in Jamaica.
Spanning roughly from 1838 into the 1890s.
Exactly. We're going to uncover the mechanics of the island's first great internal migration, this massive, desperate movement of people from the deep country into Kingston. And most importantly, we're going to shine a light on the quiet, just incredible endurance of the women who stayed behind in the rural parishes, the women who formed what the sources call the island's matriarchal backbone.
I can't wait to get into that. Let's start with that terrifying morning in 1838. I really want to understand the actual mechanics of this economic trap.
Okay.
Because if the British Crown mandated emancipation, didn't they put, I don't know, any protections in place for the newly freed population?
Well, no.
How did the planter class, the former enslavers, manage to retain so much control so quickly?
The short answer is that the Crown compensated the planters, not the enslaved.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The British government paid out roughly 20 million pounds to slave owners across the empire for the, and this is a quote, loss of their property.
Oh, wow. That is infuriating. So the newly freed population got what?
Absolutely nothing. No land, no capital, no tools, nothing. So the planter class took that massive influx of capital and immediately weaponized the landscape.
Weaponized ow.
They deliberately hoarded the most fertile, productive land on the island. They just left massive tracts empty, entirely to restrict access to it.
So they created an artificial scarcity.
Precisely.
But it wasn't just about refusing to sell land, was it? Because the sources mention this brutal cycle of debt. Walk me through the actual math of how a freed person gets trapped in debt on, day one of their freedom.
It was a highly orchestrated squeeze, so the free population was still living in the huts on the plantation grounds.
Right.
The planters suddenly implemented these exorbitant rent charges. But here's the truly insidious part. They didn't charge rent per household. They charged rent per capita.
Wait, so if you had a family of 5 living in a one-room hut, you were paying 5 separate rents?
Correct.
That's insane. The physical space didn't change at all.
It didn't. And to pay that impossible rent, you had to work for the estate. But, of course, the planters suppressed wages to abysmal levels.
Of course they did.
And to make matters even worse, they often utilized what was called the truck system. Instead of paying workers in actual cash, the estates would pay them in store credit, or in overpriced goods like imported saltfish or flour, straight from the plantation-owned store.
Oh, I see. So if your rent is 2 shillings, but you're only paid 1 shilling's worth of overpriced flour, you are mathematically insolvent the second you wake up.
Exactly. You literally cannot win.
It's just economic coercion designed to mimic the exact conditions of slavery, just, under the guise of a ledger book. They monopolized survival.
It was a perfectly closed loop. And if you tried to break out of that loop by growing your own food, you hit another wall.
Right, because of the land hoarding.
Yeah, the planters relegated the peasantry to what were called provision grounds. These were the steepest, rockiest, most marginal plots of land high up in the mountains.
Basically, the land the sugar estates didn't want anyway.
Exactly. Now, the freed population performed absolute miracles of agriculture on these rocky slopes. They grew yams, plantains, cassava, just to keep their families alive.
But then the environment turns against them, too. The sources detail how the 1840s and 50s brought devastating ecological shocks.
Yeah, it was brutal.
We're talking about severe, prolonged droughts that baked those rocky provision grounds until the yams just withered in the dirt.
And that was followed by massive cholera outbreaks in the early 1850s.
Right.
Cholera thrives in environments where people are malnourished, lack clean water, and are living in tight quarters. The epidemic tore through the island, wiping out an estimated 10% of the population.
10%. Oh my gosh. So you have a population trapped in a literal vice. Systemic economic strangulation by the planter class on one side and catastrophic natural disasters and disease on the other.
Yes.
So staying in the rural parishes wasn't just difficult, it was mathematically impossible. If staying means starvation or unending debt on a failing sugar estate, the only logical step left is to move.
The only weapon the peasantry had left was their feet. They couldn't farm, so they walked.
The sources call this the first drift, right?
Right. It was a massive, desperate, rural-to-urban displacement. Thousands of men and women realized the countryside was a dead end, so they left parishes like Clarendon and St. Anne, and they began flooding into the expanding yards and docks of Kingston.
I just try to picture the sheer sensory overload of that transition.
Oh, it had to be overwhelming.
Right. You were leaving an agrarian life, working the soil, living in the quiet of the deep country, and you were walking into the noise, the crushing crowds, and the chaos of a rapidly industrializing 19th century urban port. The smell of the ocean, the shouting of stevedores, the massive ships, it had to be utterly terrifying. But why Kingston? What did the docks offer that the mountains didn't?
Well, the docks were the one geographic location where the planter class didn't have absolute authority.
Oh, okay.
The wharves operated on a completely different economic model. It was a wage economy based on global shipping, loading, and trade. Kingston was expanding rapidly as a mercantile hub handling sugar, logwood, coffee.
So they just needed bodies to move heavy goods onto ships.
Exactly. For the displaced rural people, the docks offered a perilous, dangerous, but very real foothold outside the plantation system. It offered actual hard cash.
In a completely new way of living, too, because this is where we see the emergence of the classic Kingston yard system, right?
Yes.
These incredibly dense, crowded urban tenements where people from all different rural parishes are suddenly thrust together.
They were sharing communal standpipes for water, competing for day labor on the wharves, and, exchanging ideas. The Kingston docks became the crucible for a brand new, fiercely independent working class culture.
It's wild because this internal displacement gets overlooked so often. When we hear migration, we usually picture boarding a ship and crossing an ocean.
Right.
But this internal drift from the country to the city was the critical training ground. By moving to the city just to survive the 1840s, this massive workforce unwittingly positioned themselves right at the edge of the island, right where the ships came in.
It's a perfect point. They placed themselves exactly where a global opportunity would soon intersect with local desperation. Because once this hungry, wage-seeking workforce is established in Kingston, the outside world reaches in.
And this is the pivot that completely fractures the local social fabric. We move into the 1850s and then see another massive surge in the 1870s. The industrializing world is looking to build massive foreign infrastructure projects. Specifically, the sources point to the Costa Rican railways and the incredibly dangerous early Panamanian transit routes, the precursor to the canal.
Yes, and they need cheap, expendable labor. So foreign recruiters literally set up shop right on the Kingston docks.
Wow.
They looked at this massive pool of displaced workers who had already shown the initiative to leave their rural homes, and they offered them a ticket out.
Yeah.
The pitch was intoxicating. It was the chance to earn Panama money.
Tano money.
Yeah. They were offering $1 a day when the local Jamaican economy might only offer showing, if you could even find work at all.
Okay, I have to challenge this narrative a bit, though, because the math of that risk seems insane to me.
How so?
Well, if you are building railways in the Panamanian jungle in the 1850s, you are dealing with yellow fever, malaria, mudslides, horrific working conditions. The mortality rates were staggering. Word had to be getting back to the Kingston yards that men were dying in droves.
It was.
So why would the next wave of guys still choose to get on those schooners where things Really so bad on the docks that you'd risk a 50-50 shot of dying in Central America.
That really speaks to the profound depth of the desperation in Jamaica at the time. Yes, the letters filtering back told absolute horror stories of the jungle camps. But you have to look at the alternative.
Right.
If you stayed in Kingston, you were fighting hundreds of other men for a single day's work loading logwood. And if you didn't get picked, your family didn't eat.
God, that's bleak.
It is. The recruiters offered a signing bonus, a guaranteed wage, and an advance. So for a man watching his children go hungry in a crowded tenement yard, the risk of yellow fever in Panama suddenly looks like a rational gamble. It was a deadly lottery, but it was the only lottery available.
Wow. And because the demand from these foreign infrastructure projects was strictly for grueling physical labor,
Yeah.
clearing jungles, laying tracks, digging earth, the call for workers was almost entirely male-skewed.
Exactly. The men boarded the schooners.
Which leaves us with the defining question of this entire deep dive. If thousands upon thousands of men are vanishing across the Caribbean Sea, what happens to the massive vacuum left behind in the communities they originally came from?
Well, the departure of the men forced a sudden, radical, and permanent reorganization of who held domestic and economic power on the island. This wasn't just a temporary dip in the census data. The men who left for Central America weren't just single guys seeking adventure. They were fathers, husbands, and sons. Their absence created a structural void that had to be filled immediately.
Because life back home doesn't just hit pause while the men are in Costa Rica.
No, not at all.
The rent still has to be paid. The children still need to be fed. The crops still need tending.
Right. And this structural shift gave birth to what the sources identify as the matriarchal backbone. With the men gone across the sea, the absolute burden of everyday physical and economic survival shifted entirely onto the shoulders of the rural women. They became the sole anchor of the society.
Let's really get into the mechanics of that, because the quiet endurance required here is staggering. These women didn't just maintain the status quo. They built an entire invisible economy.
They absolutely did.
They took over the provision grounds entirely. They were the ones climbing those rocky mountain plots, cultivating the cassava and the yams.
And they also expanded the informal market system, which is known as higgling.
Higgling.
Yeah. A woman would harvest her surplus crops, load them into baskets, and walk sometimes 10 or 15 miles down the mountain to the market towns to sell them.
10 or 15 miles, carrying baskets of yams.
Yes. She was converting sheer agricultural labor into the hard cash needed to pay those exorbitant rents we talked about earlier.
I just look at these women as the CEOs of an invisible economy, managing impossible supply chains.
That's a great way to put it.
Because they were doing all of this manual and economic labor while raising an entire generation of children single-handedly, and they were doing it in an environment of extreme financial uncertainty.
And that uncertainty is the crucial element here. This new matriarchal economy was ostensibly supposed to be supported by the men sending back their wages, that famous Panama money. But the reality of receiving that money was, well, chaotic.
I can only imagine. Just try to budget for a community, pay rent to a hostile planter class, and manage your crops based on a letter from Central America that might arrive tomorrow, or in 6 months, or never.
Right, because the postal service between the Panamanian labor camps and rural Jamaica in the 1870s was practically non-existent.
How did they send money at all, then?
A worker would have to trust a returning sailor or a friend to carry cash or a postal order back to Kingston, and then hope that person actually made it up into the rural parishes to deliver it.
And never was a very real possibility. We just talked about the mortality rates.
Exactly.
A letter might not come because a ship was delayed, or it might not come because the sender had died of malaria 3 months ago, and there was no official system to notify the family.
The psychological toll of that waiting is hard to overstate. Every time a ship arrived in Kingston, there was a ripple of hope and terror through the rural parishes.
Oh, man.
The women waiting in Jamaica had to build a domestic system that hoped for that foreign envelope, but was resilient enough to function completely without it. They couldn't rely on the Panama money to survive because it was too erratic.
So they relied on their own hands, their own provision grounds, and their own market networks.
Exactly.
This completely shifts how we should view this era of history. I mean, the survival of the Jamaican diaspora wasn't just about the men who went abroad and built the grand infrastructure of the Americas.
No, it wasn't.
Those railways and canals, they get the historical plaques, but that outward expansion was permanently anchored by the economic management and the quiet endurance of the women who stayed.
They were the tether. If the domestic economy managed by the women failed, the whole societal structure collapses. The men abroad would have no home to send money to, no family to return to, no culture to preserve.
Right.
The women who stayed behind were the ones who actually transformed the hollow paper promise of the 1838 emancipation into a surviving, functioning society.
It really challenges our fundamental assumption that power and historical impact are always loud or, always involve crossing borders and building monuments.
Very true.
Sometimes the most profound strength is rooted in staying put, holding the ground, and making sure the children eat.
Which is why understanding the mechanics of this matriarchal backbone is so vital. It forces us to look past the bold print of the historical narrative and examine the people who survived the fine print.
That is beautifully said. Let's take a step back and recap the sheer scale of this journey for you listening. We started on that morning in 1838, looking at the illusion of emancipation. We broke down the terrifying math of the planter class, how they used per capita rent, the truck system, and land hoarding to create a closed loop of debt.
And from there, we traced the desperate internal drift. Because staying meant starvation and cholera, thousands fled the rural parishes for the chaotic, expanding docks of Kingston.
They traded agricultural debt for urban wage labor.
Exactly, creating a vital pressure valve in a new working-class culture.
And once they were gathered at those docks, the global market reached in, demanding cheap male labor for the deadly jungles of Panama and Costa Rica. That gendered exodus ripped a hole in the social fabric.
It did.
But in that massive vacuum, a deeply resilient matriarchal economy took root. Women stepped up to manage the provision grounds, run the higgling markets, and raise the next generation while navigating the agonizing uncertainty of the overseas male. History loves to focus on the people who left and the ships they sailed. But true societal endurance happens quietly, in the background, led by those who stay behind.
The women who stayed were the foundation that made the rest of that history possible. They absorbed the shockwaves of emancipation and built a bridge to the next century.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own. We've talked deeply about the mechanics of the Panama money, how erratic and unpredictable it was, and how these women had to build an economy that could survive the waiting.
Right.
So think about the psychological legacy of that. If the women who stayed behind were the true economic anchors, constantly adapting to the unpredictable flow of those overseas envelopes, how might that early foundational reliance on uncertain foreign money have permanently shaped the way subsequent generations came to view the complex relationship between family loyalty, financial survival, and physical distance?
It's a profound question, because when the very survival of your family depends on a letter that may or may not arrive from 1,000 miles away, it changes the DNA of a culture. It intertwines love, anxiety, and economics in a way that lasts for generations.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We loved unpacking the mechanics of this history with you, learner, and we'll catch you on the next one. Keep exploring.